Hello students, this is Tulika Banerjee from Forensic Science Unit, SGTB Khalsa College, University of Delhi, presenting this module on behalf of Professor Nisar Ahmed, PBGM College, Bhopal. I am delighted to talk about primary and secondary groups, which is a part of your curriculum for BA first year. Let us start with the general introduction of today's topic. Social group is the foundation of society and culture. Man is also a product of group life. Most of the anthropologists believe that man started his life on this earth by living together. Man has always been dependent upon his fellow beings in defense, food and shelter. The satisfaction of various needs could be done only by cooperation among various people in society. This reciprocal help brought them into social contact with one another, and here the social group was founded. It was the real foundation of human society. A social group existed when two or more people are in direct or indirect contact and communication. The members of the group stimulate and respond to one another in some meaningful way. This mutual stimulation and response of individuals and groups is social interaction. The nature and character of social relationship underlie different forms of social groups such as primary and secondary groups, in-groups and out-groups, organized and unorganized groups, formal and informal groups, and so on. The prime focus of this chapter will be primary and secondary groups, wherein we shall cover the definition, characteristics and examples of primary and secondary groups. Let us have a look on the organization of this chapter. We shall discuss the following, that is, overview of social groups, the primary groups, the secondary groups, differences between primary social group and secondary social group, and lastly the conclusion. I hope these modules will cover a detailed explanation of our today's topic. Let us move ahead and have an overview of social groups. As a clear understanding about social group is vital to grasp the underlying concept. The study of social groups is a main focus of many sociologists. In this lesson, we define social groups and differentiate between several different types, including primary and secondary groups. Social groups are everywhere and are a basic part of human life. Everywhere you look, there seem to be groups of people. A main focus of sociology is the study of these social groups. A social group consists of two or more people who regularly interact and share a sense of unity and common identity. In other words, it's a group of people who see each other frequently and consider themselves a part of the group. Except in rare cases, we all typically belong to many different types of social groups. For example, you could be a member of a sports team, club, church group, college class, workplace, and more. No two groups are created equal. Each typically has its own purpose, culture, norms, etc. Sociologists differentiate between several different types of social groups. In this lesson, we will discuss primary groups and secondary groups. Sociologists distinguish between two types of groups based upon their characteristics. A primary group is typically a small social group whose members share close, personal, enduring relationships. These groups are marked by concern for one another, shared activities and culture, and long periods of time spent together. The goal of primary groups is actually the relationships themselves rather than achieving some other purpose. The members of primary groups feel a strong personal identity with the group. Families, and close friends are examples of primary groups. The people within their contact second to the primary group form secondary group, no matter whatever the type of relationship is there. Sometimes they are also a special interest group. The intimacy within the group is relatively lower than that in primary. The relations of teacher and student, buyer and seller, voter and candidate are secondary. The frequency, duration, intensity and focus in interaction may be there, but their degree being lower than the one in primary group. The group is second in importance of life to the participants. He is first affected by the primary members and later by those in the secondary. So far we have covered definition of social group and introduced primary and secondary groups to you all. Please make sure you are clear with the basic idea behind this classification. You may want to review the module once more before moving to our next module covering the primary group. The concept of the primary group was introduced by Charles Cooley, a sociologist from the Chicago School of Sociology, in his book Social Organization, a study of the larger mind in 1909. Primary groups play an important role in the development of personal identity. Cooley argued that the impact of the primary group is so great that individuals cling to primary ideals in more complex associations and even create new primary groupings within formal organizations. To that extent, he viewed society as a constant experiment in enlarging social experience and in coordinating variety. He therefore analyzed the operation of such complex social forms as formal institutions and social class systems and the subtle controls of public opinion. Cooley used the term primary groups to mean social group characterized by face-to-face relationship, mutual aid and companionship. Some common examples for primary groups include family, neighborhood, friends club, peer group, etc. A primary group is usually small, is characterized by extensive interaction and strong emotional ties and endures over time. Members of such groups care a lot about each other and identify strongly with their group. Indeed, their membership in a primary group gives them much of their social identity. Charles Horton Cooley, whose looking glass self-concept called these groups primary because they are the first groups we belong to and because they are so important for social life. The family is the primary group that comes most readily to mind, but small peer friendship groups, whether they are your high school friends, an urban street gang or middle-aged adults who get together regularly, are also primary groups. Although a primary group is usually small, somewhat larger groups can also act much like primary groups. Here, athletic teams, fraternities and sororities come to mind. Although these groups are larger than the typical family or a small circle of friends, the emotional bonds their members form are often quite intense. In some workplaces, co-workers can get to know each other very well and become a friendship group in which the members discuss personal concerns and interact outside the workplace. To the extent this happens, small groups of co-workers can become primary groups. Ideally, our primary groups give us emotional warmth and comfort in good times and bad and provide us an identity and a strong sense of loyalty and belonging. Our primary group memberships are thus important for such things as our happiness and mental health. Much research, for example, shows rates of suicide and emotional problems are lower among people involved with social support networks such as their families and friends than among people who are pretty much alone. Mammon and Kuhel in 2008 stated this. However, our primary group relationships may also not be ideal, and if they are negative ones, they may cause us much mental and emotional distress. In this regard, the family as a primary group is the setting for much physical and sexual violence committed against women and children, as stated by Guzlin in the year 2010. Now that we know what exactly a primary group is, let's see the characteristic of primary group and primary relation. The chief characteristic of a primary group is dominance of face-to-face relations. Primary groups are characterized by close and intimate relationships. There exists a face-to-face relationship among the members. In primary groups, everyone knows everyone else. One's name and fame, one's status, wealth, occupation, level of education, etc. Close contact between them increases intimacy among the members. Face-to-face relations are commonly observed in a small group like family, children's play group, and neighborhood, and so on. The characteristic of primary relation are: first, identity of ends. Members of the primary groups have more or less identical desires and attitudes. They work together for the attainment of their common ends without disagreement. They look at the world through the same eyes. Every member of the group pursues as one of his ends the welfare of the other. The identification of ends is connected with the fusion of personalities within the group. The relationship is an end in itself. The primary relationship is regarded as an end in itself, but not a means to an end. It is neither utilitarian nor motivated by any economic gain. It is intrinsically enjoyable. True love between husband and wife or genuine friendship between two individuals is, for example, beyond the consideration of any selfish motive. The third one, the relationship personal. The primary group, the interest of each is centered in others as persons. The relationship disappears if the particular person disappears from it. As Kingsley Davis says, the primary relationship is a matter of persons. It exists because of the person, not despite him. The relationship is non-transferable and irreplaceable. Example, the relationship between the husband and wife is such that no third person can replace any one of the two. The fourth, the relationship is inclusive. The individual in a personal relationship is not an abstraction. Individuals are treated as complete human beings. All persons of the group are fused together completely. Individuals know each other very well. Different aspects of members' personality are known to all the other members. Dear students, I hope you all are enjoying this lecture. Make sure you review the previous topics covered so that you master the concepts well. It's time now to look into functions of primary groups. A primary group is a group in which one exchange implicit items such as love, caring, concern, support, etc. Examples of these would be family groups, love relationships, crisis support groups, and church groups. Relationships formed in primary groups are often long-lasting and goals in themselves. They also are often psychologically comforting to the individuals involved and provide a source of support and encouragement. I feel the need to present a suitable example for a primary group so that you all could get a clear picture. The nuclear family, which consists of a pair of adults and their children, is a good example. Members of a nuclear family typically interact on a daily basis. For them, the family is an important source of identity and purpose. Love and affection bind the family members together, and their relationships are enduring. Even when members move away from each other, they are still a part of the family. Although the nuclear family is considered the ideal primary group by some sociologists, it is not the only example. Many people are also a member of a group of close friends. This group is usually small and the relationships are still close-knit and enduring. So, it is also a primary group. The term primary is used with these groups because they are the primary source of relationships and socialization. The relationships in our primary groups give us love, security and companionship. We also learn values and norms from our family and friends that stay with us for most, if not all, our lives. This completes our module about primary groups. We have covered the definition, characteristics and examples of primary groups. Please do not hesitate to review the module in case if there is anything not understood. We will meet again with our next module, which will focus on the secondary groups. Students, until now, you all have very well understood what is a social group and got a clear understanding of primary social group. In this module, we will talk about the secondary social groups, definition, characteristics and examples. Let's begin our discussion. Although primary groups are the most important ones in our lives, we belong to many more secondary groups, which are groups that are larger and more impersonal and exist often for a relatively short time to achieve a specific purpose. Secondary group members feel less emotionally attached to each other than do primary group members and do not identify as much with their group nor feel as loyal to it. This does not mean secondary groups are unimportant, as society could not exist without them, but they still do not provide the potential emotional benefits for their members that primary groups ideally do. The sociology class for which you are now studying this is an example of a secondary group, as are the clubs and organizations on your campus to which you might belong. Other secondary groups include religious, business, governmental and civic organizations. In some of these groups, members get to know each other better than in other secondary groups, but their emotional ties and intensity of interaction generally remain much weaker than in primary groups. Secondary groups are large groups whose relationships are impersonal and goal-oriented. Their relationships are temporary. Unlike first groups, secondary groups are large groups whose relationships are impersonal and goal-oriented. People in a secondary group interact on a less personal level than in primary group, and their relationships are generally temporary rather than long-lasting. Some secondary groups may last for many years, though most are short-term. Such groups also begin and end with very little significance in the lives of the people involved. Secondary relationships involve weak emotional ties and little personal knowledge of one another. In contrast to primary groups, secondary groups don't have the goal of maintaining and developing the relationships themselves. Next, we have the definition. Some of our sociologists have defined secondary groups in certain following manner. Ogburn and Nimkoff, groups which provide experience lacking in intimacy can be called secondary group. Frank D. Watson, the secondary group is larger and more formal, is specialized and direct in its contact and relies more for unity and continuance upon the stability of its social organization than does the primary group. After understanding the definition, let us look into the characteristics of secondary groups. The first characteristic is large in size. its members are relatively larger in size than the primary one. They can be thousands and hundreds of thousands of members. Second, less physical proximity. Their physical proximity is rarely found and most of the members reside quite away from each other. Third, impersonal or secondary relation. Its basic elements are indirect, impersonal, contractual as well as non-inclusive relations. Usually, they come close to each other for achieving common interests. Fourth is membership. Membership in this case is mainly voluntary. Individuals are free to join or avoid it. There is no emotional bondage on the members. Fifth, specific ends or interest. Members of the secondary groups are interested just because they have specific ends to aim at. That's why it is also called a special interest group. Then we have indirect communication. Contacts and communication in the case of secondary group are mostly indirect. Telephone, internet, post and telegraph are the main sources of it. The next factor is social control. Here means of social control are usually formal. Laws and other regulations are enforced on the members by the authorities. The degree of relationship among members is not very strong here. This group is second in importance. Next is dominance of secondary relations. Secondary groups are characterized by indirect, impersonal, contractual and non-inclusive relations. Then, nature of group control. Informal means of social control are less effective in regulating the relation of members. Formal means of social control such as law, legislation, police, court, etc. are made use of to control. Next, we have the group structure. The secondary group has a formal structure. Limited influence on personality. Secondary groups are specialized in character. Students, I hope that you all have understood the definition and characteristics of secondary groups. Our next aim is to learn about the functions of secondary groups and look into some of the examples of secondary groups. Since secondary groups are established to perform functions, people's roles are more interchangeable. A secondary group is one you have chosen to be a part of it. They are based on interest and activities. They are where many people can meet close friends or people they would just call acquaintances. Secondary groups are also groups in which one exchanges explicit commodities such as labor for wages, service for payments, etc. Examples of these would be employment, vendor to client relationships, a doctor, a mechanic, an accountant and such. A university class, an athletic team and workers in an office are likely from secondary groups. Primary groups can form within secondary groups as relationships become more personal and close. An example of a secondary group is a committee organized to plan a holiday party at work. Members of the committee meet infrequently and for only a short period of time. Although group members may have some similar interest, the purpose of the group is about the task instead of the relationships. Sometimes secondary groups become pretty informal and the members get to know each other fairly well. Even so, their friendships exist in a limited context, they won't necessarily remain close beyond the holiday party. Other common examples of secondary groups are class project groups, college classes, sports teams, work teams and neighborhoods. All of these groups are only temporary even if they last for a year. And the relationships within the group are fairly shallow and typically touch and go. Of course, there are times when we do meet people in secondary groups that become a part of one of our primary groups. This demonstrates that the distinction between primary and secondary groups isn't always absolute or concrete. You may meet your best friend at work or school in a secondary group. and he or she then becomes a member of your primary group. With this, I am ending the discussion about the secondary groups. I hope that you all have understood the definition, characteristics, functions, and examples of secondary groups. Our next aim is to learn about the distinction between primary and secondary groups, which is going to be the topic of discussion of our next module. Dear students, by now you all have understood the definition, characteristics, functions, and examples of primary and secondary groups. Now our aim is to learn about the distinction between primary and secondary groups, which is going to be the topic of discussion for our current module, that is, differences between primary social group and secondary social group. The distinction between primary and secondary groups was originally proposed by Charles Cooley. He labeled groups as primary because people often experience such groups early in their life, and such groups play an important role in the development of personal identity. Secondary groups generally develop later in life and are much less likely to be influential on one's identity. First is size. A primary group is small in size as well as area. The membership is limited to a small number and usually confined to defined area. It is not spread over the whole world, that is, in family, play group, study group. Membership is confined within small limits. At the other end, in a secondary group, the membership is widespread. It may contain thousands of members scattered in different parts of the world, as in the case with a corporation. Next is kind of cooperation. In a secondary group, the cooperation with the fellow members is indirect. It is formed more or less deliberately and in terms of common interest in the achievement of some recognized goal. The members cooperate only to achieve the group's objective. It is not the process that binds them together, but the object to whose attainment they unite. They do not work together, but one works for the other. They do assigned tasks toward a common object. Individuals are selected to act on behalf of the whole. A hierarchy of officials arises and the executive becomes distinct from the members. In a primary group, on the other hand, the members directly cooperate with each other, participating in the same process. They sit together, discuss together, play together, and decide together. The third is types of a structure. Every secondary group is regulated by a set of formal rules. A formal authority is set up with designated powers and a clear-cut division of labor, in which the function of each is specified in relation to the function of all. The rest follows. In a word, the organization of a secondary group is carefully worked out. The primary group is based on an informal structure. The members, as told, participate in the same process. There is spontaneous adjustment in the working of the group. No formal and detailed rules are drafted. The structure is simple. Next is relationship. The relationship of members with each other in a primary group is direct, intimate, and personal. There is congeniality among the members. They meet face to face, develop direct contacts. The primary group is concerned with the total personality of a person. The relations are inclusive. A secondary group is regulated by formal rules, which mean a substitution of impersonal for personal relationships. The relations now become secondary and formal. It does not exercise a primary influence over its members because they do not live in the presence and thought of one another. They need not meet face to face, and many communicate with each other by indirect means. They perform their jobs, carry out the orders, pay their dues, and contribute to the group interest. Still, may never see each other. The members of national political party pay their annual subscriptions, carry out the orders of the High Command, work for the party interest, but hardly establish personal and direct relationships with each other. The average member plays a passive role and often comes to feel that the party lies beyond the area of his control. Paul Landis called secondary groups the representative of the cold world. Primary groups are relationship directed, whereas secondary groups are goal oriented. In fact, the warmth of the relations in primary groups cannot be found in the secondary groups. The relations in the secondary group are of touch and go type. Some thinkers are of the opinion that classification of groups into primary and secondary is not very satisfactory. No group can be classified as wholly primary or wholly secondary. Even a large scale group cannot work without a certain identification of its members with the organization as a whole. Instead of classifying the groups into primary and secondary, it is easier to classify contacts. The main difference between primary and secondary groups is not one of size or structure, but of relationship. If a nation is called a secondary group, it is so called because its members do not have close, personal and warm relations. It is devoid of personal interaction. Its members express the body of oneness through impersonal and indirect methods. Even if the members of a secondary group meet face to face, it is of the touch and go variety. Dear students, by now you all have understood the definition, characteristics, functions and examples of primary and secondary groups and the differences between primary social group and secondary social group. Since I have covered our intended topics, I'll bring an end to today's lecture. I hope you all have understood the underlying concepts of this chapter. Do keep in mind what we discussed today. I'll be back with one more lecture in this series. If you want to learn more and enhance your knowledge, you may log on to our website www.cec.nic.in for MCQs, quizzes, LORs, etc. Make sure you revise the modules frequently so that you master the topic well and take up the exercises. Thank you for your time today. Please keep reviewing the lecture from time to time. Till we meet next, goodbye.